Okay, so why don't you just take a minute and just tell us what you've been doing the last 5, 10 years and just a little bit about yourself, just so everyone could hear your voice. Dr. Kahn, why don't you start, then Dr. Katz.
Sure. If you say last 10 years, 10 years ago, I was in a standard cardiology practice, a good one in suburban Detroit, doing a lot of cath lab procedures, but I had already commenced to exit by going back and doing a lot of courses and training and certifications in nutrition and integrative medicine. Learned what social media was, kind of self-taught, bumbled my way through that. Dr. Katz is the master of writing blogs, but I learned how to write blogs and do videos and all. And just to wrap up, about 8.5 years ago, I opened my own clinic. Um, was I was told this wasn't going to work in Detroit to take extra time with patients. Everybody's kind of got a blue collar mentality here, the land of the UAW. It wasn't Santa Monica. But anyways, it's turned out to be the most fascinating, wonderful. I love my patients. I would hope that most of them would say the same about me. They get, TLC, they're school teachers and bus drivers and CEOs of multi-billion-dollar companies. Doesn't matter. We do it, it's kind of the word holistic makes me chuckle because I probably do the most advanced cardiac imaging and lab work consistent with the literature. Serve on, the boards of a few companies that are at the cutting edge. So it's a really nice hybrid. And, just for today, I think Dr. Katz will appreciate this more in the audience. I saw a woman who 5 years ago, out of town, because I have licenses in about 20 states now, had a heart attack, but she had a distinctly unusual heart attack called SCADS, spontaneous coronary dissection. And she also had these weird abnormalities of her blood vessels, which is called fibromuscular dysplasia. I had never seen a person that had two unusual vascular, probably genetic, but we don't know the genetic anomalies in one person. It turns out there is literature that they coexist. So I learned something new today. I mean, I'm talking to her and I'm reading and I'm online and expanding my brain power and wondering about what's the genome here. And I co-manage her with the Mayo Clinic, so God knows she's got other good care. But I'm fired up to keep going for a long time, as long as the health stays good, which it is very good at this point, thank goodness.
Thank you. Dr. Katz?
Good stuff, Joel. Yeah, it's amazing, Steve. Thinking about your question, a lot happens in a decade. Goes by in the blink of an eye in some ways, but as I reflect back, so 10 years ago, I was president of the American College of Life, directing Yale's Prevention Research Center. I was still seeing patients, although nearing the end of a 30-year run. I had not yet founded the True Health Initiative, but I was on the brink of doing that. And that was in some ways an effort to translate the presidency of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine into something longitudinal. And I knew I had been president-elect, and then I was president, and then I'd be immediate past president, and then yesterday's news. And I really wanted it to matter more than that. And the True Health Initiative, we can talk more about, but it's a global coalition of diverse experts coming together to say, we agree about the fundamentals of a health promoting diet. We agree about the fundamentals of a health promoting lifestyle. We agree that this is actionable and everybody deserves to know it. And we agree that we can do a certain set of things that are good for people and the planet. And we can thus chase the dream of being healthy, vital people on a healthy, vital planet. So that was established in 2015. And then for the several years after that, I was running the nonprofit. I was managing my lab, the Prevention Research Center, winding down my patient care. But a lot has changed within that decade. In 2016, February of 2016, I think my son knows the exact date. I pretty much had one of those wonderful things in science, an epiphany. I was working out at the time, I was on my elliptical, and an entirely new way to assess diet unfolded in my mind like origami in reverse. And folks in the audience may or may not know, but this has been something of a holy grail. There have been millions of dollars allocated year after year by the NIH and the Gates Foundation for fundamentally simpler, reliable, valid, scalable ways to determine what people are eating. and just had this idea. And the idea evolved, and then I ran it by esteemed colleagues to get a reality check. And make a long story short, I had to form a company to get this concept to daylight. It's now a patented innovation with multiple peer-reviewed publications and deployed to tens of thousands of people. And in 2019, after spending my entire career there, I left academic medicine to be a full-time entrepreneur. I was CEO of this company. We were acquired last year by a large food as medicine company. So I work primarily now in the private sector, which is a radical transition for me, but the mission remains the same. I really sought to do everything I could over the course of my career to add years to lives, add life to years, and to help us achieve what I think we all want, which is a population of healthy, vital people on a healthy, vital planet. We certainly want that when the population is our population, the people we know and the people we love. So different means, same ends, and here I am today.
Great. Okay. So ideally, I would like to, since we only have a short time, ask lots and lots of questions. So feel free on these questions to give short answers. I know in each one there's a lot to be said, but to cover lots and lots of topics, we'll have to settle for the moment for just short answers if that's possible. So here we go. Okay. So if someone just wants to get started, they're in their 50s, 60s, what are the essential medical tests that everyone should consider getting regularly to ensure optimal health and early detection of potential health issues? And either of you can answer that or both.
I'll jump in with a cardiology spin, and Dr. Katz can take it beyond that if he wants. We have something called the U.S. Preventive Task Force that determines and kind of dictates to primary care docs what that list is, and that gets picked up by insurance companies as what's payable. Unfortunately, there's a big gap there. And the biggest gap in my mind is there's cancer screening. There's no heart screening, with the exception of checking a blood pressure and a few very simple lab tests. So, we've had since 1990 a $100 test called a coronary calcium CT scan. It's almost perfect. It's not perfect. It doesn't show soft plaque. It doesn't show percent narrowing in arteries. But it takes a 48-year-old or a 54-year-old whose father had bypass surgery, or whose brother had a stent, or has a very high cholesterol or blood pressure, and it directly looks at heart artery anatomy and gives some feedback by something called a coronary calcium score. And it takes about 5 seconds. It involves a very low dose of radiation, like a mammogram. There's no injection. And unfortunately, despite the first publication in 1990 and 34 years later, it is rarely ordered by cardiologists and internists and family doctors and gynecologists. I'd say under 5% of people, know their coronary calcium score. And it has now been, validated, thousands of studies, that it massively reassigns people, sometimes good news, lower risk, sometimes bad news, much higher risk than their lab work and their general profile. So everybody listening should know one number, their coronary artery calcium score. Now, at some point in this hour and a quarter, we may have time to ask what's new, because that's 1990, but it's a horrible deficit. It's just the other part of the equation. It's not completely evidence-based, but there are some lab tests that should be done. The National Lipid Association, a pretty well-known organization, just published last week that everybody should know a blood test called their lipoprotein(a), a genetic cholesterol, something I've drawn in 12, 15,000 patients. Makes a huge difference in management and risk. But it's a $30 blood test that has a billing code, so it's usually covered by insurance. I like to see an inflammation test, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. I like to see a homocysteine level, something called methylation. You can do a lot more, but if you do what the primary care doc does, and you throw on these 3-4 extra tests and the heart imaging study, you've massively personalized and made more precise your assessment of that patient's risk. What diet, what medication, what supplements, what fitness, what reassurance, or what worry they need. So that's my list. And God knows I wrote a book on that topic years ago, and I republished it. And we've seen, sadly, only very small incremental advancement.
Thank you. And just to append quickly, so great stuff on the cardiac side. You mentioned in passing mammography, Joel, and obviously for women in that age group, I think you said 50 something, Steve, mammography would be indicated. Actually, there are recommendations now to lower the threshold down to 40. For women with dense breasts, that would be supplemented or replaced with ultrasound because mammography tends to be insensitive in women with dense breasts. That's a pretty prevalent condition. Colonoscopy is recommended at age 50 and sometimes younger. And I agree with Joel, an excellent resource for all of you. You can check this out and you can basically look at guidelines that are gender and age specific, courtesy of the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. You can all Google USPSTF. And then you can see what the guidelines are for you. And as Joel says, these recommendations might be somewhat minimalistic because the bar for evidence for the USPSTF is set extremely high. So they only give an A or a B recommendation. They give letter grades to the various screening programs and counseling and immunizations. They only give the highest grades if there are lots of randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses supporting a practice. And that's a pretty elusive standard. Often what we have is not evidence of absence. In other words, we don't have evidence that something doesn't work, but we have a relative absence of evidence, and then the USPSTF can't reach a conclusion. But for the foundation, it's a great place to start, and it covers cardiovascular screening and counseling and mental health and substance, cancer screening, and immunization. So a whole host of things that are useful in preventing disease. Good place to start. And then Joel, you took us in the direction, I think, of going beyond population level screening, where we would recommend particular tests to absolutely everybody knowing nothing about their health. And then we would start to layer on additional recommendations once we knew you. And so, if somebody has heart disease in the family and we're not finding evidence of that in the standard risk factors, you might dive deeper. You might do a more involved lipid panel. You might look for atypical risk markers. You might want other inflammatory cytokines, and on it goes. And similarly in other areas where the testing for vulnerability and risk could extend to genetic markers like the BRCA genes that are associated with breast and other cancers. So at some point, we leave the realm where this is recommended for everybody just because of age and sex, and we get further into the realm of we need to know something about you. And if there are indications that you have other potential vulnerabilities, then the testing goes on and on. So, Steve, it's not a one-size-fits-all list, but the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force is a great place to get the fundamentals right.
Thank you. There's a lot of authors with very popular books promoting keto and paleo diets. They're very emphatic. They're very confident. They have lots of views on YouTube. And no matter how many whole food plant-based speakers or books come out, they still come out with more and more books on low-carb diets and more about this. So the question is, where do you stand with people eating diets that are keto or paleo? And then also, if you do eat a whole food plant-based diet, what is your position on seeds, nuts, avocados, and olives? In other words, is it a problem if you have lots and lots of that in your diet? Seeds, raw nuts, avocados, and olives. And then even if you can have the seeds and nuts, are the saturated fat nuts, such as macadamia nuts, Brazil nuts, cashews, that have higher saturated fat, more of a concern? If you could comment on that.
I cede to Dr. Katz.
Okay, so you lumped many things together, Steve. Let's line them up and knock them down. So the first thing to address is low carb, and in some ways it's fundamentally silly because all plant foods are carbohydrate, and the idea that we should avoid all plant foods, to me, is an outrageous concept at odds with the vast preponderance of scientific evidence. So people conflate carbohydrate with refined carbohydrate, added sugar, white flour. And yeah, we would all be better off limiting our intake of added sugar and white flour. So some carbohydrates are not so terrific, and avoiding them is perfectly fine. The idea that we should curtail intake of all carbohydrates is basically like saying that jelly beans and pinto beans or lentils and lollipops are the same, because they're all carbohydrate sources, but really quite absurd to suggest that these have comparable health effects. So I'm opposed to using macronutrient thresholds to talk about diet quality. They really miss the point. But that said, you actually can have a low, if you will, bad carbohydrate plant-based diet. And the leader in that space is Dr. David Jenkins at the University of Toronto, inventor of the glycemic index, by the way. Many years ago, he was concerned with the popularity of the Atkins diet and thought, well, if that's where people are going, to a low-carb diet, can we have our low-carb plants and eat them too? In other words, can I develop a high-quality, plant-based, low-carbohydrate diet where I use an operational definition of poor-quality carbohydrate? And the answer was yes. He called that the Eco-Atkins diet because it had ecological benefits as well as human health benefits. So you can check that out. Dr. David Jenkins, University of Toronto, Eco-Atkins diet. So it's possible to have a plant-based low carbohydrate diet if you use the appropriate definition of low carbohydrate. You mentioned keto. I'm not a fan. It's a highly restrictive diet. Few people can sustain it over time. We have no evidence that it's compatible with long-term health. There are some medical uses. A ketogenic diet, a truly ketogenic diet with extreme restriction of carbohydrate intake, can be effective in ameliorating intractable seizures. And the reason it does that is it quiets electrical activity in the brain. Now, I don't think a healthy person who's not having intractable epilepsy wants the electrical brain activity dampened, but the ketogenic diet appears to do that. I'm not a fan. Most versions of the ketogenic diet rely on a lot of animal foods. That's bad for the animals, bad for the planet, and bad for the people consuming the diet. And again, it's so restrictive, most people can't maintain it. You also threw paleo in the mix, Steve, and the simple reality is we all had ancestors in the Stone Age, so we all come from ancestors who went through a phase of human existence where the paleo diet was the only diet. It was the Paleolithic era. Everybody ate that way. There's a lot of debate about exactly what the paleo diet was, and for the most part, an agreement that there were probably many variants on the theme of the paleo diet. Some paleoanthropologists suggest that even then our diets were overwhelmingly plant-based, but most of them agree there were some animal foods. But the animal foods our Paleolithic ancestors ate were dramatically different from what people waving a paleo banner today are eating. There was no Paleolithic pepperoni. There was no Paleolithic bacon, right? So people ate meat in the Paleolithic. They were eating wild animals that they hunted, and those animals were lean. They were actually relatively rich in omega-3 fat in their flesh. They were low in saturated fat. So paleo is something we may want to unpack further. I think the answer there is it depends. If you ate mostly wild plants and hunted wild animals with a bow and arrow and ate those as a small part of your diet, do we have any evidence that that's harmful to people? We actually don't. Now, again, we don't have studies comparing an optimized paleo diet to an optimized vegan diet to say what the outcomes would be. But I'm not sure it's really relevant because 8 billion hungry Homo sapiens can't be foragers. We don't have enough space on the planet, right? We can't all be hunting. So I actually did the math for a column I wrote once, and for 8 billion people to be hunter-gatherers, we would need 15 times the surface area of the Earth. So from my point of view, it's a moot question, right? Maybe the paleo diet was very good in the Stone Age, but Dorothy, we're not there anymore. And finally, when it comes to nuts, seeds, olives, avocado, I'm fine. I think they're perfectly good. I'm trying to give brief answers, but we have, for example, the work of Dean Ornish, which just showed us that you can regress coronary atherosclerosis and prevent recurrent events with a very low-fat plant-based diet in people at high cardiac risk. But we actually have much the same evidence, the same prevention of recurrent cardiac events from the Lyon Diet Heart Study, which uses a high-fat Mediterranean diet, but it was good fats. So it was the very sources you're talking about: nuts, seeds, extra virgin olive oil, olives, avocado, probably a bit of fish and seafood in the mix too. So I don't think we need to restrict total fat to have an optimal heart healthy diet. I think we do need to consume the right kinds of fat. And then lastly, you raised the issue of what about the saturated fat in the nuts, and in particular, certain nuts like hazelnuts. The answer is it depends. There's nothing intrinsically bad or evil, if you will, about saturated fat. In fact, we need some. It's all about proportionality and total quantities. The modern diet is terribly unbalanced. We get excesses of saturated fat, excesses of omega-6 fat, insufficiencies of monounsaturated, certain polyunsaturates, omega-3. Anything that moves us in the direction of a healthy balance is generally tolerated very well. Anything that moves us away from balance is bad. So if the only source of saturated fat in your diet, or the primary source, is nuts and seeds, it's very unlikely you're going to consume too much. The problem for most people is they're getting lots of saturated fat from meat and dairy, and then the hazelnuts are adding insult to injury, right? So then you want to be concerned about extra saturated fat from any source. But in the context of an otherwise optimal plant-based diet, I wouldn't be terribly concerned about the saturated fat nuts. I think I covered everything you queued up, if not close.
Thank
Nothing to add.
Okay, and what about if I also threw in coconut products into that?
I'll comment on that. You know, the research is relatively limited. There are very tiny little areas that coconut is a major portion of their diet. Everybody brings up this tribe called the Kitavans. I think it's 1,200 people in the world. Not a lot of basis to make worldwide recommendations. But, you know, we know that the saturated fat content of coconuts and palm oil is the highest, you know, of anything recorded, 85, 90%. There are some studies that coconut oil disrupts our gut lining and allows bacterial products called endotoxins into our bloodstream more than almost any other oil out there. These are animal studies, but they're not what you'd want to reproduce for your own gut. So I generally tell people you've got so many, you know, wonderful oils, and I predominantly focus on extra virgin olive oil. There's just no reason to add an unknown with a bad reputation of coconut oil in the diet. You know, you're in Jamaica once a year and you have a coconut and you drink the water. I think you should enjoy.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, the principal saturated fat in coconut oil is lauric acid, short chain saturated fatty acid. There is some research to suggest, and by the way, that's an important concept in its own right. Saturated fat is a family of molecules, and they don't all behave the same. So there's saturated fat in dark chocolate, stearic acid, which does not appear to be atherogenic or pro-inflammatory. The prevailing saturated fats in meat and dairy, myristic and palmitic acid, clearly are. Lauric acid, the jury's out. But I would agree with Joel. There was never any evidence to support the very hyped health claims for coconut oil. So the best we can say is, you know, maybe it's not as bad as the very high saturated fat content would suggest it might be. We have no real evidence of health benefit. I think about the best we could say is maybe because it's principally lauric acid, it might be relatively neutral in terms of direct inflammatory effects. But then again, there are these indirect effects mediated by the microbiome that also have to be factored in. So I would say occasional use is fine, because it has desirable culinary properties, or it's part of something you want to eat, or it's something you want to do on a vacation. But I would not turn to coconut oil seeking health benefit.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if either of you have any background with multiple sclerosis, but if someone said, I have a 60-year-old woman had multiple sclerosis, would you recommend they go on a whole food plant-based diet? Would it move the needle? Would it do anything? And you can answer that for any other conditions that are related to multiple sclerosis.
I just comment there's a famous dietary pattern based on the chief of neurology in, I believe it was Portland of Oregon, University of Oregon, Dr. Swank, maybe Eugene Swank, if I remember, he's deceased. And he was fascinated. His clinical focus was multiple sclerosis. And he had some observations that then he applied on using very low saturated fat diets. And generally, if you want a very low saturated fat diet, you're going to get a largely plant-based diet. And it was a unique patient observation because it was 50 years of follow-up. Dr. Swank lived to a pretty old age. And some of these patients he personally followed for 20, 30, 40 plus years. And actually, there's 50-year data. And he reported the biggest deficit was, most people would say, if you're going to say you've halted or even made some advancement in multiple sclerosis, you need MRI data showing improvements in white matter changes. At the time, Dr. Swank was practicing, he didn't have that baseline and follow-up MRI data. It was all just clinical observation. But he reported in peer-reviewed published data that this low saturated fat, largely plant-based diet was beneficial in multiple sclerosis. The other dietary pattern that's out there is, oh, why am I blanking on my nice friend who's at University of Iowa, and she's an internist, and she had multiple sclerosis. Um, David, if you remember the name of who I'm talking about, she's an MD, a compelling story of being in a wheelchair and being able ultimately to walk and even do some light jogging because of a diet that was, 9 servings of fruits and vegetables. Terry Walls, WAHLS, MD, TERY Walls, MD. And there's a very popular book. And, there's a plant-based version and an almost plant-based version, but one of the cleanest, organic, high fiber, microbiome friendly diets on the planet. And she's actually, to her credit, published some peer reviewed data also on the impact, and many people follow that. So look up the Swank diet and look up the Walls diet, and eat 9 servings of greens and blueberries and nuts and seeds, and you probably will do something good for your brain.
I thought the name you were looking for, Joel, was Suresh Stanchik, who
Oh,
also
that would be
lifestyle
another
medicine physician.
plant-based one. Thank you. Yes.
Right, right. Suresh, who did the documentary Code Blue, had an autoimmune condition, turned to plant-based nutrition, and had a dramatic recovery. The answer to your question, Steve, is a simple yes. I would highly recommend whole food plant-based nutrition. It's dramatically anti-inflammatory. It's vital support for the nervous system, the circulatory system. It minimizes your exposure to compounds that really should be no part of human nutrition, which are often immune system stimulants. And yeah, Joel, I think great comments. And to my knowledge, the Swank diet also recommends high intake of omega-3, so low intake of saturated fat. So it's often richly supplemented with omega-3 fatty acid. And for vegans, you can get that not directly from fish, but from algae, and I'd highly recommend that. The omega-3s that have the widest array of anti-inflammatory effects, specifically on the CNS, are the long chain omega-3s, and they're typically associated with fish and marine life. But the fish and marine life are getting them from algae. And there are vegan supplements that derive long chain omega-3. So we're not talking about ALA, alpha linolenic acid, which is the omega-3 you find in nuts and seeds, but icosapentaenoic acid, docosahexaenoic acid, the long chain marine oils, you can get them directly from algae. So I would add that at relatively high dose if I were actively treating MS. And I've seen in some of my patient care dramatic responses to plant-based nutrition. And I think these benefits extend not just to MS as a specific condition, but to any autoimmune state. And often in these conditions, we can measure markers of inflammation and see how they improve with an anti-inflammatory diet. And there's nothing more anti-inflammatory than optimal plant-based nutrition. In some cases, we don't have inflammatory markers, and then you're just tracking symptoms. But I think it's a very pertinent recommendation. And really the only rate limiting thing is the willingness of any given patient to give it a go.
Thank you. We're going to have a speaker named Nathan Bryan, who wrote a book on nitric oxide. And if you read the book, he basically, my interpretation is to eat greens and eat them a lot, and that there's tremendous benefits to kale. And it seemed like a wonderful book. And then the conference, we had all these speakers saying greens are fantastic. It's a fundamental part of a whole food plant-based diet. And then we had a dentist who's not vegan, and she said that she sees patients, and because of oxalates, they have teeth problems and bone problems. And she said she had a patient who had their teeth were getting worse because too many oxalates. Now, this is contrary to almost everything I've ever heard on greens, but I don't want to be dismissive. I don't study this, so I don't really know what is. And then, that Sally Norton wrote that book, Toxic Superfoods, and she had a whole thing about oxalates. So a lot of us really want to embrace sprouts and greens, and we really want to get the benefits of it. But we are a little bit concerned when people say that we should be concerned about oxalates. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I'll take the first part. I'll take Nathan Bryan, and I'll leave oxalates for Dr. Katz. Nathan is a friend. I've interviewed him multiple times. He's written some really, he has several companies that make, he calls them nitroceuticals because they emphasize nitrates through beets and other natural products. He's, a PhD. He's done research on this. Of course, the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1998 was for the three gentlemen that led to the discovery of the critical role of nitric oxide in vascular health and total body health. Uh, you have to be careful when you interview Nathan Bryant because he is a Texan and has a cattle ranch. And don't go talking diet with him because he's a big time beef eater. So it doesn't work well in some of the plant-based summits and symposiums that are going on. But I still respect his science. And, yes, chewing greens, eating beets, watermelon, pine nuts, they either contribute dietary nitrates, they contribute citrulline. That's what watermelon does so well. Pine nuts contribute citrulline. So you can enhance your vascular health through certain intelligent dietary choices. Of course, the famous Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn talks about if you're having symptomatic heart disease, trying to enhance your nitric oxide production by eating greens, steamed greens, a little balsamic 5-6 times a day. I find my patients incredibly challenged by that. And most of them don't have, symptomatic heart disease. So I tell them back off a little bit. It's not really a compatible thing to do for the rest of your life unless you're highly symptomatic. But I'll give oxalates and anti-nutrients to Dr. Katz.
Yeah, and Joel, that's exactly the framework I was going to bring up. So there are anti-nutrients or anti-metabolites in all foods, and famously, you can find carcinogenic compounds at very low concentrations in organic broccoli. So this to me is a classic instance of failing to see the forest for the trees. So if you fixate on a given moiety compound molecule in a food and you explode that out and focus just on that and say at high dose exposure in an unbalanced dietary pattern, this anti-nutrient can cause all kinds of problems, therefore avoid the food. What you're failing to consider is what are the net effects of eating that food in the context of a healthy diet over lifetimes and generations. And frankly, we have that evidence. We have evidence from short-term intervention trials, but we also have evidence from large-term, long-term ethnography looking at whole populations who've lived on plant-based diets. And oxalate excess is not causing harm. Now, if you have a very unbalanced diet, if you're just eating leafy greens and you don't have a balanced portfolio of foods, then the net effect of anti-nutrients becomes more of a concern. But it's interesting, Joel. Obviously, the circles we travel in, and frankly, Steve, you too, and the audiences that assemble for this conference, you can't help but notice when you get together with people who are eating plant-based diets. So, they're, for the most part, lean, healthy, vital, glowing skin, healthy hair, long-lived people. That's not anecdote. When you get together with 2,000 people at the American College of Lifestyle Medicine annual meeting, it's just, it's shocking how vibrantly healthy the audience is on average relative to any other health conference you could attend, but for the conferences that attract, people with similar dietary inclinations. So oxalates are clearly not doing any harm in the context of a healthy, balanced diet. So sure, you could have an unbalanced diet. What we're hearing from this dentist is an anecdote, but what do we know about this patient? What do we know about what else they were doing? What do we know about their other behaviors? What do we know about their baseline health? And what do we actually know about their diet? So, it may have been somebody who was experimenting with a vegan diet, did it badly, have a very unbalanced diet, and perhaps there was some harm. It's possible to succumb to harm from anti-nutrients. But the net effect of foods that promote health is health promotion. And yes, they do carry along some anti-nutrients, oxalates in the mix, but it comes out in the wash when you're eating wholesome foods in any sensible, balanced assembly. So not concerned.
Thank you. If you could access any 10 data points, including results from any medical test, detailed information on an individual's diet or exercise habits, level of any mineral or vitamin, cholesterol levels, blood sugar levels, salt intake, which would you choose as the most critical, the most crucial to predict which among a group of 1,000 40-year-olds are most likely to maintain good health until 95 years old?
I'll jump in here and then pass to Joel, since Joel, you've gone
Yeah.
first for every other. And I'm going to make a confession here. This is one of those instances where I've got a hammer and see nails. I spoke earlier today, Steve, and my talk was about the evidence-based case for diet as a vital sign. And the reason to make that argument is because an objective measure of overall diet quality is the single leading predictor variable in modern societies for all-cause premature death and total chronic disease risk. So you said a list of 10, so I could talk about 10, but if I had to pick the top entry on that list, I would love to know an objective measure of diet quality. And then I'd like that to be actionable, because essentially that shows us what's broken and how it's broken and provides us a template for what needs fixing. Now, there's a lot of other good stuff I'd like to know, but I'll leave that as my answers. The first entry on the list of 10. Pass to you, Joe.
I wish we had such a perfect test that predicted so much for so long. I could actually circle back to the coronary artery calcium scan, because a 0 at age 48, 50, 52 has been associated with better lung function, better brain function, better kidney function, lower risk of diabetes. There's something about avoiding vascular calcification that reflects a body-wide benefit. So if you had to say it's a test, whereas David has suggested a dietary index, which he's a world expert on, the test would be probably the heart calcium score, which is fortunately very simple, very safe, and very inexpensive. The metric I was going to bring up just for a foil would be some sleep measure, because I think we've learned repeatedly, for example, the American Heart Association used to have the Simple 7, and they've now upgraded it to called Life's Essential 8. And the new one they added was some metric of sleep quality. Do you get 7 to 8 hours? Is it relatively uninterrupted? And do you have the absence of sleep apnea? And in my own practice, when people sleep well, they work out, they eat better, they're trimmer, and they're sharper. And it certainly has been related to a whole host of diseases if you do have sleep pathology. So that would be my number 2 and 3, a coronary artery calcium score and some maybe Oura ring, watch, or just general home sleep study. Home sleep studies are almost mundane now, available, inexpensive. So I would add that in.
Thank you. Could you discuss any studies that compare the health outcomes of vegans to omnivores in terms of dementia and bone health?
Oh, all over the map.
I can get started. So,
Yeah.
what we don't have, Steve, is long-term intervention studies. We certainly don't have randomized controlled trials to show differential rates of dementia. We once again have observational data, ethnography, what happens to populations, starting with the blue zones, where the diets are quite diverse in 5 populations around the world, but are all plant predominant and emphasize real food. So basically, they follow Michael Pollan's prescription: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Extremely low rates of dementia among centenarians. They live to be 100, and despite those extra years of life, do not develop dementia. That's a pretty compelling argument that if you get diet and lifestyle right, it effectively prevents dementia much of the time. That's been translated into research, in particular in the MIND diet. So the MIND diet is an adaptation of the Mediterranean diet, and it blends it with some other dietary insights with a focus on foods that are thought to be particularly good for cognitive function, mental health. And to the extent that you can look at short-term markers of the risk of dementia, and that's a very limited extent, there's some evidence in support of the MIND diet. There are retrospective studies that have looked at basically people who did and did not develop dementia and looked at differences in their diets, and those lend support to plant-based nutrition. So the answer to your question is a qualified yes. There are studies that compare plant-exclusive to omnivorous diets, suggesting benefits in terms of long-term cognitive function for high-quality plant-based diets. but those comparisons are limited. So, for example, we don't really have long-term studies comparing optimal Mediterranean, which would be an omnivorous diet in most instances, and optimal plant-based. Um, there is a study now looking at the green Mediterranean diet, which basically says let's preserve the cultural relevance of a Mediterranean diet. Let's preserve the focus on extra virgin olive oil, but let's make it plant exclusive. And in the studies I've seen to date, Joel, and feel free to comment on this, comparisons of the green Mediterranean diet to the standard omnivorous Mediterranean diet show benefits in the short term on biomarkers. I'm not aware of any that have specifically looked yet at rates of dementia over time.
Yeah. No, yeah, the green Mediterranean diet is actually a shout out to Israel because it's being done in Dimona, the city that's notorious for perhaps being the city of the nuclear reactor that the Israelis have. But they add this unique Israeli plant called the mankai, which is the world's smallest microplant, and it's nutrient rich and has B12. It's a plant that makes B12, and it used to be available in the United States. I have a freezer full of mankai at home, but it's about 3 years old. They stopped shipping it here. That's just a little aside. Um, again, let me take on dementia, because I just did a podcast, my weekly podcast on some new data about the frequency of hidden silent brain disease in cardiac patients, atrial fibrillation patients, hypertension patients, heart patients, a new massive study, and it's very high frequency. But, one of the predominant causes of dementia is vascular dementia. A second one would be atrial fibrillation, which is often related to obesity and sleep apnea and hypertension and cardiac abnormalities. What's going to be better for vascular disease, a plant-based diet or a saturated fat heavy paleo diet? Now, there are some really clean versions of paleo diets. Like, I hate to say it, some of my best friends are paleo eaters. One of my son is included in that group. But overall, with a large enough population, the data supports that whole food plant-based diets, by lowering blood pressure, lowering blood sugar, lowering blood cholesterol, lowering inflammation markers, are going to prove to be very good for brain health. Yes, take your B12 for God's sakes, and make sure your omega-3 content of your diet is high, and maybe check or replace your vitamin D levels. But whole food plant-based will win for vascular dementia. Whole food plant-based will win for dementia related to atrial fibrillation. There's a phenomenon Dr. Daniel Amen, a famous psychiatrist, calls the dinosaur syndrome. The bigger the body, the smaller the brain, because brain atrophy is a major contributor to dementia. And on average, there's always exceptions, but in populations, whole food plant-based eaters are leaner and smaller BMI, which is going to potentially be associated with better brain health. So a lot of reasons to believe, but it's just silly to, people argue it's a terrible thing to eat whole food plant-based because you might have to take a couple supplements, and you might not need chemotherapy, and you might not need lifelong blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood pressure and blood sugar medication, but you got to take B12. I mean, pick what you're going to supplement with. I don't want to supplement with chemotherapy if I can help it. And there's no assurances. I don't tell anybody you're bulletproof because you're eating a lot of arugula. However, if you can stack the odds, it's like wearing a seatbelt, you're better off.
I completely agree. And good point, Joel. So, Steve, you asked specifically about evidence and dementia and dietary comparison. So I unpacked that, but I think it's a really important point. So that there are a variety of forms of dementia. Very often it's vascular disease. And even when it is formally Alzheimer's disease, there are two main themes in the scientific literature about Alzheimer's. One suggesting it's basically an end product of insulin resistance in the brain. So it shares risk factors with the metabolic syndrome. And yes, there are genetic markers that put you at increased risk, but there are metabolic markers as well. And then another that really looks at Alzheimer's as, in many ways, a form fruit of coronary disease. The same process of inflammation and atherosclerosis damages the brain. But in many instances, it's not Alzheimer's, it's multi-infarct dementia. And that may be related to atrial fibrillation and emboli, may be related to atherosclerotic disease. And we certainly have very strong evidence that optimal plant-based nutrition is effective against those. And that's indirect evidence of all the benefits to the brain as well as the heart.
Thank you. Dr. Mark Hyman champions the nutritional benefits of fish, particularly omega-3 fatty acids and pro-resolving mediators for brain function, inflammation control, cellular health, metabolic processes, and longevity, highlighting their scarcity in modern diets and their comprehensive contribution to a balanced diet. However, Dr. Michael Greger warns about seafood's contamination risks with pollutants and heavy metals. Given these insights, is incorporating fish into our diet more beneficial or detrimental to our health?
Well, I don't know. I risk being politically incorrect here, but
Yeah,
Dr.
yeah.
Mark
Go for
Hyman,
it, because if you don't, I will.
you're going to. Dr. Mark Hyman has promoted this, that, and the other thing, depending on which book he's selling. And I would steer clear of anybody who changes the fundamental perspective they have on nutrition because they're promoting a particular book or product. We all need to follow the science. We all need to be humble and avoid absolutes. And when you see a lot of hype and a lot of certainty about diet A, because you're selling diet A, and then that same person hyping and selling diet B sometime later, which rejects some of the concepts. I personally recall pictures of Mark sporting a "Butter is Back" T-shirt when he was promoting butter in one of his books. So, from my point of view, that type of source is very questionable. So I'm not sure why we're concerned about what he's recommending. But okay, scarcity of fish in modern diets. What about scarcity of fish in the ocean? Let's for a moment leave aside the net health effect of eating, say, fatty fish on humans. Frankly, we don't have much hope of being healthy, vital people if we don't have a healthy, vital planet. And destroying biodiversity is ruinous at the foundations of planetary health. So that's a consideration to me, which is why you've heard me talk several times tonight about sourcing long-chain omega-3s from algae. And there are vegan supplements that make it very easy to get EPA and DHA without consuming fish. So if the concern is the scarcity of fish is not providing you these omega-3s, get the omega-3s. And that way you avoid the toxins too, because these are purified and heavy metals are taken out. In terms of that, if we're going to take those two sources comparably seriously, and frankly, I don't, Gregor's point about the toxins in fish is certainly valid. Animals bioconcentrate the toxins they encounter in water, in soil, in plants. And in fact, the larger the fish you eat, the greater the concentration of heavy metals, because large predatory fish eat smaller fish, which ate smaller fish, which ate plants or plankton, and there's bioconcentration all the way up the chain. That said, when we talk about the health benefits of fish, most of the time we're talking about omnivorous diets, where we're recommending people eat more fish and less beef. And there, the net effect we tend to see is a health benefit. So one of the things we often miss, Steve, when we're having these debates about good or bad, this versus that, is context. You're talking to an audience of people who have balanced, wholesome, whole plant food diets. Is there a net benefit to you of eating fish? No evidence that there is. I don't know that we can say for sure that there isn't any, but no evidence that you need that. And if what you do need is long chain omega-3, you can get that from a sustainable source like algae. Most of the evidence we do have for a health benefit of fish is as a substitute for people who are eating hamburgers and hot dogs all day long. And frankly, they're exposed to toxins in that as well. The net effect of eating more fish and less beef tends to be beneficial to people, but that's obviously a context we're probably not in with most members of tonight's audience.
Thank you.
Nothing to add. There is no evidence that fish reverses atherosclerosis. Frankly, in humans, I'm unaware if it's ever been studied. In an animal model, it actually promoted atherosclerosis. It's just a better choice than a cheeseburger.
What are your thoughts on salt, 1, alcohol, 2, and coffee, 3, in whether these are something that are neutral, something to avoid, something to add? What are your thoughts in terms of people that want to have optimal health on these 3 items: salt, alcohol, and coffee?
Give it to you, David. Go for it. You know it.
Okay. So salt, we get too much. It's an essential nutrient. You don't want to avoid sodium. Joel and I, in our medical training, have both seen hyponatremia. It's bad. It can kill you. Low levels of sodium in your blood, bad thing. We need enough, but we all get too much. In fact, in the US, we mostly get twice as much as we need, and that stresses the heart. It's associated with hypertension. The evidence is really very clear. The water was muddied because a particular group, and it really was one small group of people, raised the concern that we could overshoot and restrict sodium too much. And yeah, that's true. It's an essential nutrient. You don't want to go too low, but we're so far over the recommended threshold. We have a long way to go at the population level before we need to worry about it. Bear in mind, for the average American, 80% of the salt they consume comes not from a salt shaker, but from processed food. So if you're preparing your own food, and if you're mostly eating at home, and if you're eating a whole food, plant predominant or plant exclusive diet, you've already eliminated the prevailing source of sodium in the typical American diet. And it's perfectly fine to use a salt shaker judiciously, because that little bit of salt added to the surface of food adds potentially a lot of flavor and not a whole lot of sodium. But the answer to the question is sodium is important. And yes, we want to limit our intake of it if we're exposed to the prevailing modern diet. Alcohol, you should not consume alcohol for health. There are actually some favorable effects of alcohol per se. It raises HDL cholesterol, and it appears to raise the active fraction of HDL cholesterol. It raises endogenous TPA, so it has essentially some anti-blood clotting effects. But there are many liabilities with alcohol, and this is a classic case where the dose makes the poison. So there are all sorts of ways alcohol can hurt you, and the net health benefit from alcohol is small and can be found from many other sources. And there is an association between even quite modest alcohol consumption and a slight increase in the risk of cancer, especially in women, where the strongest association is with breast cancer. So I would not turn to alcohol for health. On the other hand, alcohol is a source of pleasure, and pleasure is healthy, but you want to control the exposures. You want to do this sensibly. So frankly, I really enjoy a glass of good wine with a fine meal. It creates a memorable experience, something that I'll talk about with loved ones. I think that's fine. So alcohol can certainly be part of a healthy diet, lifestyle, but you're not deriving any truly meaningful health benefit from the alcohol. So you needn't avoid it entirely, but there's a balance between modest risk and modest benefit if you're consuming moderate amounts of alcohol. And finally, coffee, if you're not highly sensitive to it, if you don't have tachyarrhythmias, there's actually pretty good evidence that moderate intake of coffee is associated with some cognitive benefit. Caffeine is a brain stimulant, so there are actually direct tests of cognitive function, caffeine versus placebo, and after caffeine, people perform a bit better. And no evidence of net harm, and brewed drip coffee actually contains some antioxidants. Relative to a whole food plant-based diet, it's not a rich source, but it's actually not bad. So generally, net health benefit, but there's some caveats. If you drink too much or you drink it too late in the day and it's keeping you awake at night, you're paying for that coffee with insomnia. That's a bad trade-off. So you want to be careful about that. And coffee isn't always coffee, is it? It's mocha, frappa, latte, etc. So what you put in it is really important. So, is the coffee really coffee, or is it a whole lot of other stuff with a little bit of coffee added? Because then your question, Steve, reverts to what is all that other stuff? Because some of that may be junk. So you want to be careful about what you put in your coffee. But I'd say sodium, be careful. Alcohol, for pleasure more than for health. And obviously be careful about dose and context. And coffee, most people really don't need to worry, up to 3 cups a day.
And I'd only add, in terms of coffee, 2 comments. We were taught in cardiology for years, if you're having palpitations, skip beets, high blood pressure, avoid coffee. In the last 12 months, there have been a number of studies have examined the question, and it's paradigm changing. It doesn't seem to be related to palpitations, atrial fibrillation, so modest amounts. And the second thing is a drip coffee without a paper filter can raise cholesterol modestly.
Right.
There's several components. I think they're called caffesterol. But a simple little paper filter in your coffee drip captures them. And there actually is one study in the European Journal of Cardiology that people that drink coffee drip without a filter versus people that drink coffee drip with a paper filter, 25,000 people, there actually was a difference in heart attacks over time. Because, a 10-point difference in cholesterol times 25 years may translate into
In a
something.
large population. Yeah,
So
agreed.
put the
So that
paper filter in, it doesn't really pertain to espresso. And espresso, is going to have some of these cholesterol lowering components. But if you've got the Mr. Coffee style coffee maker, put the paper filter in.
and most Americans do, Joel. And so the type of coffee maker that tends to be associated with cholesterol elevation would be a French press.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if every now and then you're on vacation and there's a French press, you needn't run away from
Right.
it. I enjoy that coffee every now and then on vacation, but yeah, use a drip coffee maker at home.
Thank you. One of the things that people love about both of you is that you do research and you use evidence-based research to tell us what the evidence says. You're not just giving a random opinion. But Dr. John Abramson, who wrote the book Sickening in 2022, says one of pharma's best kept secrets is that the peer reviewers charged with ensuring the accuracy and completeness of the clinical trial reports published in medical journals do not even have access to complete data and must rely on manufacturer-influenced summaries. Likewise, for the experts who write the clinical practice guidelines that define our standards of care. So he's saying that the whole country is relying on doctors who are reading medical journals, and the medical journals are filled with studies that industry had a say over. So how do any of us, including yourselves, know when you're reading data that's pure versus data that's biased from the industry?
I'll take it. I mean, I read that book about 3 months ago. It's sitting on the coffee table in my office for people to look at. John Abramson is a MD, Harvard trained and Harvard faculty physician, pretty unimpeachable credentials, and you can't ignore him. And he does indicate that a vast majority of a medical journal's income is directly from pharmaceutical companies buying reprints of trial data that they then give out to doctors, and the price they pay to the journal is quite high, and it can generate hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for one journal, certainly prestigious ones like New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, and others. And it's problematic. And the other problematic is what you said, that much of the pharmaceutical data is sponsored and largely paid for by pharma, and they own the data, and they do not share the original raw data worksheets for people to go over. And there's a movement to undo that we've seen over and over, that subsequent analysis. It's going on right now with a drug called Repatha, injectable cholesterol drug, that there is a group that's raising hell that the original data wasn't analyzing completeness, and that it hasn't been published, and they got a FOIA. They had to go to the extent of getting a Freedom of Information Act to get more of the data. So I don't know the answer to it, other than there are intelligent people that are focusing heavily on trying to change the rules. And to some extent, we're screwed a little bit by, you talk about right now, Wegovy, Novo Nordisk, Ozempic. I mean, it's the most highly valued company in all of Europe of any kind of company. I mean, that's a pretty big bat to swing around when it comes to journals and advertising, and and now it's extending to America with TV ads everywhere. They got unlimited resources. So I do not know. I do not know the answer, but it's a big problem.
So Steve, you basically queued up two things, and Joel addressed one. So absolutely, the financial might and the bias and the influence of big pharma is definitely a concern. You also asked specifically about peer review and lack of access to primary data. So I've been a peer reviewer innumerable times over the course of my career for many, many journals. Joel, I'm sure you've done the same. And I've never been in a position where I have made a request for more data and been told, we've checked with the authors and they say, go to hell, you can't have it. Because then I'm in a position to say, well, then reject the paper. So I'm not sure that gambit really works because the journals do rely on peer reviewers. And if we feel we don't have adequate information in the paper and need additional information we can't get, it's a simple decision. Reject. We can do that. We have the power to do that. That's what peer review is all about. So unless the peer reviewers are all on the payroll for the company that did the study, and I haven't really seen much of that, then we're talking about a real conspiracy. Most of the time, I have not needed to look at primary data because I have seen adequate representation of the data. But let's be clear, that involves some level of trust. And I think it's a useful concept for this audience to consider. We are dependent on one another. Let's imagine that you said, okay, you've given me, you did your statistical analysis, you've shown me all of your data, but not your raw data. In other words, I've seen the aggregated data. So I've seen the distribution of a given measure, blood pressure, body mass index, but I haven't seen the numbers for each individual participant in your trial. I need to see the raw data. But you're still left to wonder, is it a truthful representation of the raw data? And how did you get the raw data? Should I come to your lab and test the device you use to measure people's weight to make sure it's appropriately calibrated? We're all stuck trusting something. And what if it's blood work? I need to know what lab you used that ran the assays. And did they do the assays right? And were the chemical reagents at some level of remove? We're obligated to operate on some level of trust. So, unless we do that, we can't function as a collective society. So again, I think the influence of big pharma is a big concern. The influence of lack of access to primary data in the peer review process, I have not experienced that to be a big concern. And if you see inconsistencies in the data reported and say, I need more data, you either get the data or you reject the paper.
Thank you. What do you think about Ozempic? Should people, you can use this? Is this a reasonable approach to weight loss?
I'll go first here quickly, Joel, and then pass to you. I spoke at some length about this in my talk earlier today. The drugs appear to be quite remarkable in all the things they can do. But for me, the fundamental problem is blaming obesity, because that's really where we're talking about the widespread use of these drugs on the bodies of individuals as opposed to the body politic, because we have a toxic, corrupted, willfully manipulated food supply. We have disrupted lifestyle, hectic schedules, lack of physical activity. My big concern, so the drugs have their role, just as resuscitation has its role for drowning. But we don't wait for everybody to drown so we can resuscitate them. We do all kinds of things to prevent people from drowning. We have lifeguards at beaches and fences around pools and parental vigilance and teach people to swim. So that's my big concern about these drugs. It's the easy medical approach. Let's neglect diet. Let's neglect lifestyle. Let's not fix anything in our society that's broken. Let's let everybody become obese and sick, and then let's fix it with big pharma. I don't think that's a very good idea.
And I've been very slow to take it up in my clinic, maybe 25, 30 prescriptions. There's a challenge to get it through the insurance system. There's also a way to get it through compound pharmacies, but that's all cash-based and a little elitist. There are clearly concerning medical side effects you have to monitor for. I've been told there's many class action lawsuits already. And my biggest concern is the yo-yo. If you don't teach a patient some skill, some cooking ability, some exercise ability that, either they're on it for life, and we obviously don't have lifelong data. We have 74-week data in the clinical trials, or they're going to come off of it at some point. And, 75% of people regained all the weight rather quickly in the clinical trials. So, is it a temporary bridge to a whole food plant-based diet with a gym routine, with better sleep, with optimal vitamin levels and monitoring? Yeah, it probably serves a role. And right now in cardiology, there's a study called the SELECT trial, and the FDA just approved these drugs, or specifically semaglutide, as an adjunct to cardiovascular care. They're not going away, and people are now speculating in terms of anti-aging, but I can't imagine injecting myself once a week, for years and years and years. Of course, diabetics do it, but a lot of this is serious medical issues, and unfortunately, a lot of it is vanity issues, and we got to weed out the vanity issues.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely a role for these drugs. They're potent and seemingly rather remarkable drugs, but not without side effects, potentially serious. Maybe we don't even know all the long-term effects. But again, not at the expense of addressing the root causes. And that's my big concern. We medicalize everything, drugs and surgery, when we could get at the root origins of vitality and prevent the problem from developing. I also worry about kids, families, right? You're not going to have the family plan for Ozempic. But if the parents are obese and taking drugs, how will that influence what they share with their kids about a healthy lifestyle? May undermine it completely. And then the message is what? Wait until you grow up and have all these same problems, and then you can go on pharmacotherapy too. So we've got to get the balance right.
Okay, if you would each, Dr. Kahn first and Dr. Katz, make a closing statement of any final thoughts you want to leave our audience with tonight.
Yeah, I quote a colleague and the great Garth Davis, a bariatric surgeon in Houston, a medical doctor. I chose long ago to be whole food plant-based for a variety of reasons, but ultimately the science, it wasn't because I was invested in broccoli stocks and sprout farms. It was because the science is, I'd say, 95% to 5 in favor of a whole food plant-based diet for disease avoidance, for disease therapy, and probably for longevity, and just do it optimally with some vitamin supplementation that's rather inexpensive and rather simple. And the only counterfoil would be it's not bulletproof. And, do your mammogram and do your colonoscopy and do your Cologuard and get your heart calcium CT scan. There are, a large burden of genetic inputs to disease that, although we say the lifestyle, genes load the gun and lifestyle pulls the trigger, sometimes genes pull the trigger. So, do all the proper screening testing that Dr. Katz talked about before.
Thank you.
And Steve, I'll close by saying pleasure to be back with you. A real pleasure, Joel, to have some time with you, both prior to our live presentation, a little bit of chatting there, and interacting with you here. And then pleasure to be with the audience this evening. And I would say when I think about diet and health, I'm looking through 3 lenses. I'm looking at direct human health effects. I'm looking at the effects on our fellow creatures. And I'm looking at effects on the environment, the climate, the planet, ecosystems like the Amazon rainforest. And through all 3 lenses, you see dramatic benefits of whole food plant-based nutrition. Sorry, you see some of the other species I love very much, unfortunately noisy at the wrong time. So it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to address the importance of this issue and get at the evidence. Sorry, canine mayhem. I'm going to mute myself.
Dr. Kahn, if we want to follow up with you, stay in touch with you, what's the best way to follow up with your work, your lectures, your books? How do we do that?
Yeah, single source, drjoelkahn.com, drjoelkahn.com. I think you just put up a slide of an online summit I do with the great Dr. Joel Fuhrman. Oh, I guess that is my website. We have that summit, but visit me at my website. I got a weekly podcast and weekly blogs and clinic opportunities to be seen and just some fun stuff.
Do you do virtual sessions with people?
Yeah, in about 20 states. So all the big ones and some of the fun small ones. And I apologize if you're not one of the ones you live in, but people do actually come to Detroit.
Thank you. And Dr. Katz, how would we follow up with you and your work?
DavidKatzMD.com kind of leads to all the different things I do. And for the work that I'm doing these days, DietID.com.
Okay. Can we unmute the audience so they can thank the speakers?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joel.